In this lesson, we'll be talking about probably one of the top two most common critical reasoning tasks you'll encounter on the executive assessment, and those are going to be questions asking you to weaken an argument. So let's start just by recapping the critical reasoning logistics in the executive assessment. First, we assume there's going to be somewhere between 3 to 5 critical reasoning style questions in the 14-question verbal section. You're going to assume 1 to 3 critical reasonings in each 7-question half. And there's going to always be a single paragraph pertaining to a unique question task. So there's just like a little bit of information, and then you have to address whatever the individual question task is. In this case, potentially weaken the argument. Now, your strategic best practices for this question type, you're going to assume that there's a 2 minute and 30-second per question average. So a little bit more than your about 2 minutes and 10 questions if you just averaged out that 30-minute section over 14 questions. You're going to have a hard cap of 3 minutes for any individual critical reasoning. And you need to note the task of the question before engaging the prompt. Don't read the paragraph and then read the question and then reread the paragraph. Instead, figure out what you need to do first. You also may consider tactically skipping all critical reasonings on the first pass through one of the 7-question halves of the executive assessment to make sure that you see all of the questions, because generally these questions are the primary candidate that you'll want to skip if you need to, but you'll have to take targeted notes to force engagement and proactively address that specific question task. In this case, we're going to talk about predicting how to weaken an argument proactively. And as I mentioned, this is your primary question format to just bluntly guess and skip, especially in the second half, if you have fewer than 15 minutes remaining after question 7. Because remember, you're going to aim for 15 to 18 minutes for the second half under the auspices that you are hoping to reach a harder second half of each of these 2-half sections. So, how do we identify weaken the argument task? Well, first you need to recognize that there is an argument being referred to in that question stem. And then you want to note the task words, such as weaken, undermine, or doubt. And there's going to always be new information provided in the choices that you have to assume is true and apply to the situation to determine if it might actually make the conclusion seem less reasonable. Now, strategically, these are going to be one of the more straightforward critical reasoning tasks, so you're less likely to want to skip blindly a weaken the argument question because it's relatively straightforward in many cases. You'll need to begin by reading the prompt and identifying the explicit conclusion of the provided argument. You always need to identify it almost verbatim because you don't want to get outside of the scope. You want to then attempt to categorically identify the type of argument to broadly predict what possible support might be, and we'll be doing that here in a moment. You're going to focus on your common wrong argument answer choices to eliminate incorrect options. And you can eliminate more quickly if one of your choices matches your prediction pretty closely. So we recap our argumentation equation. We know that all arguments are going to end in a conclusion, which is your explicit subjective opinion requiring some sort of evidentiary support that comes from your premise, which is your explicit objective facts that are intended to provide that support. And in between the premise and the conclusion are what are known as the assumptions. And the assumptions are the implied, unstated facts that must be true to provide the link from the premise to the conclusion to make everything seem logically sound. So, how do we actually weaken an argument? Well, what we have to do is actually attack the assumption. So, you need to locate additional information to show that one of the implicit assumptions linking the premises to the conclusion is actually unlikely to be true for some reason. And while arguments can, again, be categorized in multiple ways, focusing closely on the specifics of the premise, so like what kind of evidence is provided, can help to broadly predict how one of the choices might undermine the claim by showing one of those assumptions to be unlikely. So let's talk about our common argument attacks. Our first common argument type is going to be an analogy. And an analogy just assumes that the items are comparable in relevant ways. So in order to attack an analogy, you need to show that there are differences in the items that are relevant that may have been overlooked. You also have representation as a common argument style, and that is going to always have the assumption of the evidentiary sample being representative of whatever the larger whole population is in the conclusion. And a likely attack to weaken a representation-based argument is to potentially highlight subtle term shifts from the evidence to the conclusion that show that actually the two items aren't exactly the same in the evidence as the conclusion, or in some other way, show that the provided sample is not representative of the overall population. For instance, saying that Austin doesn't necessarily represent all of the state of Texas, for instance. So let's take a look at a sample weakened task. So first, we need to recognize the key term indicating a weakened task. We always read the question stem first, and here we can already see highlighted the word undermine, indicating a weakened task. So which of the following, if true, would most undermine the argument above? I'm clearly being asked to weaken this argument. Then you're going to read the prompt as presented, and we're going to note types of evidence provided to potentially recognize a common argument. And you can see in the prompt, which we'll read here in a moment, I've already highlighted a couple of terms because this is an example of that term shift we talked about with representation. So, looking to artists for political insights is largely a fruitless endeavor. Most statements made by great artists indicate that creativity and political acumen rarely go together. In fact, most great artists hold political views with no more nuance than those of the average citizen. So, we then, of course, have to find the exact conclusion, and it's relatively easy to identify. It's the first sentence. Looking to artists for political insights is largely a fruitless endeavor. I don't believe that without some sort of evidence, and the evidence comes further in the little paragraph. Then we want to broadly predict what the correct answer should do to weaken the argument based on the reasoning. And since we've identified that term shift, we know that to weaken, we want to show that the views and political insights of great artists are not representative of the political insights of artists more generally, because we've got that subtle term shift that happened in the evidence of great artists that became just simply artists overall. So we introduce the answer choices, and we then want to process eliminate for common wrong argumentation reasons, starting with vague impacts. And we can see some of those here. So choice E, we've got some great artists harbor political aspirations. Wonderful. I have no idea how many. Some is incredibly vague. Then we've got many in choice D. Political acumen is a vaguely defined concept for many. The word vague is in here. This is clearly vague. I don't know how this affects our identified predicted issue of great artists not necessarily being representative of all artists. So we can eliminate D as well for this reason. And also for choice B, we've got great artists can draw large audiences for their commentaries on contemporary issues. Okay, are they political issues? Can draw? Okay, do they? I'd have to make quite a few logical leaps to make this do anything to the argument. And if anything, it probably ultimately ends up being closest to a strength in anyway, but you just identify the vagaries here, and you can say, I don't know what that necessarily would do to our claim at the beginning of the paragraph. You also, of course, have argument or choices that need additional information. In this case, B kind of needs additional information. There is some overlap in the reasons to eliminate here. And then we also have that task reversal, something that strengthens, not weakens. We said that B maybe strengthens, but A certainly does. So if an average citizen does not, on average, hold particularly nuanced political views, well, saying that the great artists hold political views with no more nuance than those of the average citizen says that the great artists don't have nuanced or particularly nuanced political views, kind of attacks their political competency or understanding. So it's saying that the great artists don't have much insight. Again, it's not a great argument, but if anything, this is strengthening, which is the opposite of what the task is seeking. But choice C, the struggles experienced by most artists make them very familiar with many political issues. Well, struggles experienced by most artists, well, that means that most artists struggle. And if most artists struggle, they probably don't become great. So this addresses in a roundabout way the exact issue and prediction that we had of how to weaken in the first place based on the representation term shift, and choice C is our correct answer. So now, some other common argument attacks. So we know that data and evidence interpretation is going to be another common argument type, and those types of questions are going to assume that there is no other reasonable interpretation of the data or evidence. So in order to attack that kind of argument, you need to find additional data, often some sort of numbers, potentially even percentages, proportions, or other evidence to support an alternative interpretation of the information. And whenever an argument provides specific numbers on the executive assessment, you really do want to pay attention to them closely, because it can almost become like a data sufficiency sort of thing where you've got to make sure that you're not making assumptions about like many being a majority. I don't necessarily know that. And again, you want to address those types of assumptions and ambiguities that are directly relevant to any argument. Then we, of course, have causality. We know that all arguments can basically be considered as a causality. And a causality just assumes that there are no other possible causes or outcomes, and that the circumstance is not merely coincidental. So your likely attack is going to identify another likelier cause or outcome. And possibly that's going to be done by making the circumstance seem coincidental, so that it just was so that they happened at the same time. They weren't actually causally related. And then, of course, we have our plans or recommendations. And we always assume for every plan or recommendation that the plan or recommendation is going to be executed, and whatever the approach is will work according to the defined metric of success. And your likely attack is going to provide information to show that the execution of the plan or recommendation will not result in success as defined by the argument, or that it's just unnecessary entirely. So let's take a look at another example here. So we've got another prompt and question stem. We go straight to the question stem first. We recognize the word weaken, so clearly this is a weaken task. Again, these tasks are easier generally because you don't have to try to figure out what it's saying and what it wants you to do. It clearly wants you to weaken the claim about Canadian schools. We even know what the claim is going to be in this case. So then we want to read the prompt as presented, noting the type of evidence provided to possibly recognize a common argument. We see must implement. That indicates that there's some sort of plan being recommended. So let's read the paragraph. Canadian schools must implement daily aerobics to make their school children healthier. In India, school children spend at least 15 minutes per day participating in aerobic activities, and they have been shown to perform better in several physical fitness metrics than their Canadian counterparts. Okay, so we've got a reason to implement the plan, some sort of evidence. So we've got the clear conclusion. We already knew what it was. It's what we must implement from the beginning of the paragraph. And then we want to broadly predict what the correct answer should do. So we need to show that the plan to implement daily aerobics is either not necessary or otherwise won't work to make Canadian school children healthier, because that is the intent as explicitly presented. So we introduce the answer choices, and we're going to process or eliminate for our common wrong argumentation reasons, starting with things that might have a vague impact, such as historically resisted participating for choice D. Canadian school children having historically resisted participating in mandated exercise. Okay. Does that mean they won't in the future? I don't know. And just anything that involves past performance does not necessarily mean future behaviors, but that term historically incredibly vague. I have no idea whether or not the plan is going to work, whether we can, based on this. You can't just say because they have historically resisted doesn't mean that we can't mandate them to do it now. So who knows? So that goes away. You can also have answer choices that need additional information, such as about the health of adults. So choice A, we've got aerobics have been shown to be beneficial to the health of adults as well as that of children. So again, wonderful. At best, this is going to strengthen the argument, but it's a really big stretch already. And then we've got task reversals that do more explicitly strengthen the argument as opposed to weaken it, such as choice B. We've got Indian school children are known to have diets that are higher in fat and sugar than are the diets of the average school-age child. Well, that's telling us that it seems, or at least there is a reason, that the India children may be a little bit less healthy on average because they're already eating, but they ended up performing better. So it makes it seem like the plan that they're doing in India to offset the higher fat and sugar diets is somehow working, basically. So B would strengthen the plan, make it seem like the aerobics are helping the Indian school children. So we could assume that, or we should implement it in the Canadian schools theoretically. Additionally, we've got choice E, which is any time spent exercising is better than no time spent exercising. This also could be categorized as vague. This doesn't say aerobics, so exercise is probably a little bit of a jump in a term shift, kind of like what we saw earlier. But at best, this is going to strengthen because it seems like we should implement a plan to do exercise, whether it's aerobics or not. But if we consider choice C, physical fitness priorities vary widely across different countries and cultures. Well, this is basically introducing an analogy aspect of the plan. And it's saying that you can't compare Canadian schools or Canadian school children to what Indian school children are doing, because those physical fitness metrics may not define health for Canadian Canadians culturally. So choice C addresses a specific reason that the plan doesn't seem like it's going to work, may not even be necessary because we don't know whether the Canadian schools are going to prioritize those physical fitness metrics that the Indian schools perform better in. So we can select choice C for basically finding an analogy assumption to attack within the plan. So our checklist for weakened task. First, you need to identify the weakened task by recognizing those key indicator terms and the presence of an argument with some main conclusion. Then read the prompt as written, paying close attention to the type of information provided in that premise, and note the explicit conclusion. If you can identify a common argument, you'll be able to more specifically predict what the correct answer should do to weaken or attack the argument based on that type. If you can't identify a common argument, you'll just use the generic prediction of find info to weaken the conclusion that blank, whatever the conclusion is. And lastly, of course, seek a match to your prediction and eliminate choices that fail to address the task of weakening the question using your common wrong answer reasons. So let's head on over to the whiteboard and attempt a couple of questions together so you can see how you'll engage with your scratch work when you're attempting weaken style critical reasoning questions on the executive assessment. So here we have a sample critical reasoning prompt. We've got A through E. We put a little line over top, and we always want to start by identifying what the task is. So we skip to the end here and we find which of the following, if true, so again, there's that if true phrase, cast the most doubt on the claim about the egos of modern architects. So this actually tells me my conclusion before I even get to the paragraph. We know we have to weaken the claim about the MA egos for modern architects. So I'm going to just put a little PW up here for predicted way to weaken. And we read from the beginning. So this comes from an architectural critic. For a modern public building to be considered both functional and inviting, it must fit unobtrusively into its surrounding environment. For this reason, modern architects must be willing to set aside their egos to create functional, inviting public buildings. So for this reason indicates a causality. So we can see that it's basically saying that because it has to fit unobtrusively, they have to set aside their egos. So our predicted weaken is basically to attack that causality. So we need to find info to show that just because the building is unobtrusive doesn't mean I can just use a not equal sign here. That MAs for modern architects must set aside their ego. So now we go to our answer choices seeking a match to that prediction. So in the 21st century, public buildings are found in a vast variety of environments. Okay, wonderful. That has absolutely nothing to do with our prediction. If we've got a good prediction, we don't even really consider this any further. But again, a vast variety of environments, that just asks more questions than answers. So we'll just say that that needs additional information about the varying environments and what they mean and how they relate to the architect's egos and all that sort of stuff. The function of a given building can demonstrably affect its design. So that's saying that the building's function is going to affect the design. And if that is what affects the design, then it might be less so attributed to the modern architect. So if anything, this would be a task reversal. This makes it seem like they do have to set their egos aside because they're going to have to focus more on the function than trying to put in whatever details or style that they personally have themselves, the modern architects. Now, choice C, again, unobtrusive buildings are not often recognized for architectural awards. Well, if that's the case, and a modern architect wants an award, potentially to satisfy ego, then they're going to have to set aside their egos. So this too would fall under the category of a task reversal. Then we've got choice D. Public buildings more frequently experience cost overruns than do private residences. Well, there's a whole bunch of additional information that's necessary here. I don't know about private residences. I don't know how cost ties into the ego thing. There's a bunch of unanswered questions for choice D. But choice E, modern architects are more interested in gaining recognition from expert publications than from passing members of the public. Well, the building being unobtrusive and fitting into the surrounding environment means that the public may not notice it, but the expert publications still might, and that could satisfy the modern architect's ego. So choice E addresses this pretty nicely. You have to make sure that you don't get distracted by the other answer choices. Remember that each answer choice is equally reasonable to select just from like a percentage standpoint. 20% roughly is going to be all of these answer choices on the exam. So you just have to make sure that you're considering them all equally, and you'll come to E as the correct answer here, hopefully without too much delay. Now, if we scroll on down, we got another example here, rather lengthy one. So here, once again, we're going to set up the scratch work. We got A, B, C, D, E, put a little line over top, and we can see we're being asked to undermine the reasoning, so that means we have to weaken. Unfortunately, this one doesn't tell me what the conclusion is in the question stem as nicely as the previous one does, or did, but we're going to set up our predicted weaken again. And so we read direct comparisons of Africanized honeybees and honeybees native to South America have consistently shown that the Africanized bees produce a significantly greater amount of honey during a given harvest period. Therefore, fears that a northward migration of Africanized honeybees would decrease North American honey production are clearly exaggerated. Oh, that's a mouthful. So part of the reason for repurposing the prediction or the conclusion into the prediction is to make this just make more sense almost in an affirmative fashion. We can see from the therefore that this is our conclusion. So if we're trying to weaken, I want to simplify and not just say show information that the decrease is clearly exaggerated. That's just really quite convoluted English. But we want to show that the North American honey production will go down, basically, because the decrease is not exaggerated. And again, if we don't have enough time to produce a more specific prediction, we can just say find info to show that the North American honey prod will go down after we'll say AH for Africanized honeybees migration northward. So we got our prediction direct from the conclusion, and we go through our answer choices. So a significant amount of honey produced in North America is harvested by hobbyists who are incapable of altering their techniques to accommodate a change in bee species. Well, we can see that there's certainly a theoretical change in bee species. And when that happens, they can't alter their technique. So if they can't alter their technique, they seemingly won't be able to produce the honey. And so this basically is showing that the NA honey production goes down with the AHs because that's a switch. So we get that as a real nice match to our prediction, even though it's a broad prediction. And that frees us up to go much more quickly and just kind of look for those vague quantifiers, those additional information pieces to try to eliminate our remaining answer choices pretty quickly. So in choice B, we're talking about plant reproductive cycles. That definitely needs additional information. Choice C, the migration of the African honeybees from South America to North America could take decades. Well, that's incredibly vague. Choice D, the studies involving the Africanized and South American honeybees were conducted by a joint North American and South American team. Okay, that I need more information about. And the natural harvest period of Africanized honeybees is slightly shorter than the natural harvest period of honeybees native to South America. Well, that makes it seem like the Africanized honeybees are even more efficient. So that too can be eliminated as something that would strengthen, not accomplish the task of weakening. And for that reason, choice A would be our correct answer here. So go ahead and practice your own weaken tasks for critical reasoning questions to get better at this aspect of the verbal section.